2 events in a row, very impressive for the Art Museum. So, welcome everyone to our final lecture for the year. Imagine, my gosh, 2020, we had such high hopes and so many events planned, and then COVID struck just a week after we opened in our new home. But we will, continue with events next year. So even though the centenary of 1920 will be over, we'll go into 21 and start to look at the end of the War of Independence and the start of, the treaty negotiations and stuff. So this series will continue. And we have other exciting, plans. So I have no doubt that 2021 will be, even though it'll be hybrid in real life and online, it'll be very good. And now there's a little caveat here. Most of you probably know I'm not a massive De Valera supporter. So I'll do, I think I was objective in the research, and I had researched this years ago. There's a ton of very good, if you're ever in a public library, like the Devoy papers are down there, so you can see some of the letters that they wrote. I did some work in the National Library at home in Ireland too, because I thought this would be a chapter in my dissertation, and it ended up not being a chapter, but it's just such an interesting, time. So I've lost a lot of my original research because a laptop, kind of exploded on me, but I had great stuff, so it's all still in the libraries. So, we'll look tonight at De Valera's War of Independence, which meant that he spent a year in America. There is a quip in Ireland which says, Ireland has had 3 historical periods: the pagan era, the Christian era, and the Devil era. Devil era. Arguably this is true, because no other figure has dominated Irish politics and history, particularly in the 20th century, more than Eamon de Valera. And it was perhaps inevitable that the United States, specifically Irish Americans, would become involved, at least in a peripheral way, in the Irish national struggle. Now, these are not really related to what I'm talking about because it's hard to get the specific pictures. The first thing to be said about De Valera, actually, to be honest, is that he was very unknown in America until almost as late as his own visit in July 1919. He figured in none of the major contemporary books written about the 1916 Rising, whether they were written in Ireland or in the United States. That's not surprising. He wasn't a signatory of the Declaration of Independence, and although he was sentenced to death because he commanded the battle at Boland's Mills, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment instead because of his birth in America. He was let out, but was imprisoned again in May 1918, and was held in prison until his escape in February of 1919. So that really, he rose to prominence as a leader in Ireland while he was absent from Ireland, and he was kind of the last one standing. Everybody, they were very young, don't forget this 1916 generation, aside from Arthur Griffith, in his late 30s, early 40s, and so all of the signatories were gone, the labour leaders were gone, a lot of the women, of course, were left, but nobody was listening to the women. So essays written in the aftermath of the Rising, like James Stephen's memoir, The Insurrection in Dublin, which was printed in 1916 and reprinted in 1919, made no mention of Eamon de Valera. Neither did most works. George Creel, who in January had visited Ireland to get information for President Wilson, published Ireland's Fight for Freedom in July of 1919. It had a photograph of Eamon de Valera on the frontispiece, but there was only one reference to him in the text. So de Valera escaped from Lincoln jail through a scheme of Michael Collins. They literally imprinted a key on a soap bar and all of this, and he came out dressed as a woman. And he was elected president of Dáil Éireann in April 1919, having stood for election while in prison, and of course that famous 1918 election where Sinn Féin agreed to abstain from Westminster. In June, so he smuggled himself to America on board a ship dressed as a sailor, but started in the hold. It was very, very uncomfortable, a lot of rats. It was a terrible journey. And in 1920 June, Harry Boland kind of teased the press that De Valera will emerge today from the shadows, because there had been rumours that he was in America, and he will emerge today from the shadows and silence that have enshrouded him since he came into America somehow, sometime. And at 5:30 he will step into the presidential suite of the Waldorf Astoria to greet his friends and tell the world the prospects of Irish freedom. He had come to America and gone to Rochester to visit his mother. He kind of did a few small trips to Philadelphia and things. He had to get clothes bought for him, imagine. And so it was a packed few weeks and months before he actually emerged publicly. In answer to the questions, who is Eamon de Valera, what does he stand for, and who does he represent, Harry Boland continued, he is here, that's his mom when he went to see her in Rochester, What does he stand for? Boland said he is here as a direct representative of the people of Ireland to the people of America. And there he is with Harry. He was chosen by adult suffrage through the peaceful democratic machinery of the ballot. He is therefore entitled to speak for Ireland with authority from the standpoint of democracy equal to that of the President of the United States or the Premier of France or of Great Britain. It is noteworthy that although the Wilson administration was not sympathetic with Irish agitation, the State Department let it be known that De Valera would, quote, not be interfered with unless he violated American laws or runs contrary to our treaty stipulations. His activities in America were never hampered by official interference, even though he had no passport and had arrived as a stowaway. So he came to the United States to achieve two intermediate objectives, De Valera told the American press. He told the mayor of San Francisco, James Rolfe Jr., that he came to America to float bonds for our country and to get your financial support for our industries. But the main thing I want to get in this country is recognition of the Irish Republic. De Valera positioned Ireland as a small emerging nation for whom the League of Nations, which was of course Wilson's idea, could be advantageous if it acknowledged Irish independence. He had essentially parachuted, however, into the midst of an awkward situation. Irish Americans were quite opposed to the President Woodrow Wilson over American membership in the League, and veteran Irish American politicians believed that an international alliance would, like the League of Nations, would render impotent any subsequent efforts by the United States to challenge Great Britain's territorial sovereignty over Ireland. The reluctance of the State Department to confer legitimacy on Ireland because of Anglo-American post-war relations compounded these matters. So while De Valera and the Irish revolutionaries were not forgiven by sectors of American opinion for their anti-British or pro-German statements that they had made during World War I, Irish Americans were at least sufficiently rehabilitated to enable the Senate to pass a resolution urging the American Peace Commissioners in Paris to secure for Edward De Valera, Arthur Griffiths and Count George Noble Plunkett a hearing before said conference in order that they may present the case of Ireland. Now we know that meeting in Versailles went nowhere. Wilson refuses to meet the Irish delegation. Of course, we know now Wilson was quite sick during those talks, but nothing happens in Paris. And so even though the war had been fought, you know, for poor little Czechoslovakia, quote unquote, and to secure independence for certain countries, Ireland's pleas went unheard. Bringing his case to the people of America, De Valera addressed mass meetings in 56 cities from New York to San Diego. The 3,000 miles between the Atlantic and the Pacific coasts must have seemed endless in the pre-jet age of indirect rail transportation. One journalist compared his trip across the United States to General Sherman's Victorian march across Georgia to the sea, and a description of a mass meeting of 40,000 people in Chicago conveys a sense of delirium. For 26 minutes, quote, the president stood unable to speak, while the huge crowd cheered in a frenzy of enthusiasm. The president was lifted to the shoulders of his uniformed bodyguard, composed of American veterans of the World War. Flags, American and Irish, rippled over the sea of faces, and all the while the crowd yelled, screamed, and in many cases broke into tears in the intensity of enthusiasm. The Gaelic American newspaper, which John Devoy was editor and owner of, wrote, "The Irish in America agree with De Valera and follow his bold and wise leadership, and De Valera in the plainest and clearest terms expressed approval of their words and actions." The response of James Murray is typical of the excitement of that first trip. The enthusiasm manifested by the people of Butte, where he addressed over 10,000 people in July of 1919, on that occasion was the most marvellous I have ever witnessed, and the address of President De Valera was interrupted frequently by the wildest applause. Clearly, the crowds that came to hear De Valera came to cheer and not jeer. If speakers mentioned President Wilson, they were often frequent hisses and boos, but De Valera quickly put a stop to that. 25,000 people roughly at the Cubs ballpark in Chicago listened to him as he scolded them like a schoolmaster. He said, "I would be deeply humiliated if my presence in your country and my advocacy of the just and reasonable claims of the Irish people should be made the occasion of any demonstration of hostility to your president. He is your president, and whilst as Americans you have the right, no doubt, to criticise, you will forgive me for saying, I feel it is not in good taste before a stranger. I am here to get the aid of all lovers of liberty in America, and they embrace all sections. Those who would identify us with any section, and those who act unworthily of what is a holy cause, are, even though it be unconsciously, the worst enemies of Ireland." De Valera concluded cleverly, One or two in a meeting can make a great noise, and it would be a very obvious device for those who are opposed to our cause to send agents for that purpose. This adroit bit of scolding was sufficient to suffocate any anti-Wilson outbursts, but slight enough to have no adverse effect on de Valera's personal popularity, nor the popularity of his cause. So this picture was taken on the roof of the Waldorf Astoria. This is Devoy, the old Fenian, who had been in America since the 19th century, de Valera himself, Judge Daniel Coghlan, and Goff. And these were the main members of Irish America, particularly the Friends of Irish Freedom. And of course, these are the people who will break with de Valera later on. So the Friends of Irish Freedom was an Irish-American Republican organisation that was founded only a few weeks before the Easter Rising of 1916. Now, of course, don't forget, there had been organisations in America since well before that. Even Thomas Addis Emmet, Robert Emmet's brother, was here in the very early 19th century. Not that he was doing anything for Irish independence, but he had come out of that Republican tradition, and there was these kind of speeches at St. Patrick's Day that always wished Ireland well. And so 1916 Rising had been planned, a lot of it, and certainly funded, and the contacts made with the Germans out of New York, particularly through Devoy. The Friends of Irish Freedom pledged to assist Ireland in its fight for independence. Clan na Gael, which had been the earlier kind of organisation, and which was mirrored in Ireland by the IRB, played a key role in the foundation of the Friends, as 15 of the 17 executives were members of Clan na Gael. After the Easter Rising and the First World War, the number of members soared. Perhaps the two most important figures who spearheaded the Friends of Irish Freedom in America were Judge Daniel Coghlan and the old Fenian John Devoy. In the view of Coghlan and Devoy, it was crucial, however, to display a high level of loyalty to America and American values in order to avoid any potential criticism that they were merely foreign agents attempting to influence press and public opinion on matters which did not directly concern the United States. This attitude became a prevailing theme for many Irish Americans throughout this period and was dramatically heightened following US entry into the First World War in April 1917. And so I think last year I gave a talk about George Creel. We certainly have an exhibit about it too. The pushback against ethnic Americans, or as Ted Roosevelt called them, hyphenated Americans during World War I, really hit the Irish and the German communities in America at that time, because advocating anti-British stuff or advocating pro-German was seen as not the right thing. And so the fact that the 1916 Rising was kind of established out of New York was weighed heavily on the Irish Americans. Irish American organisations in America were financially secure. Now, sorry, this is sort of him at the other side. So this is, oh God, I think it's McGarity. I have to check the news in a minute. And that's Harry Boland out of Ireland, and Liam Mellows. And that's McGarity. I forget who your man is, but Devoy's with them. So he's the only one in this photograph that kind of breaks. All the rest of them stay on de Valera's side. So the Irish organisations in America were financially secure. Even with the large expenses incurred during 1919, when they kind of arranged this trip, the treasury of the Friends were still over the $1 million mark. Sentiment for Irish causes was at the high water level, and voluntary contributions were so easy to obtain that the Hibernians and the Ladies' Auxiliary felt that it would be unnecessary to go beyond their own organisation in order to raise $5 million for Irish freedom. Certainly, as long as the Irish Americans remained united in their actions, any pressure which they would bring to bear for the cause of Ireland could not be easily disregarded or minimised. They were a force to be taken into consideration. But in 1919, the average Irish American did not fully understand what the exact nature of Ireland's political demands should be. In general, they wanted freedom for Ireland. Some saw it as recognition of the Irish Republic, quote unquote, by the United States government. Others saw it as self-determination for Ireland. So the public at large made little distinction between those two, because both seemed to embody their hopes and dreams. Even some of the leaders of the movement in America lost sight of the fact that a drive for recognition of the Irish Republic elevated the issue to an international level, while a fight for self-determination would maybe limit the scope of the issue to being just a domestic quarrel that should really be settled within the United Kingdom. There was many red herrings, of course, which obliterated the real issues, and so the confusion is understandable. But without making the distinction between self-determination or recognition, interested Americans moved ahead in the initial steps of the fight. pre-De Valera's visit, by organising sympathy. I'll go back to these, those are all pictures of him in America, but so like these ones. By organising sympathy, enthusiasm and devotion to the Irish cause, it was somehow hoped that enough pressure could be brought to bear as a force, and which could force a settlement which would be favourable to the Irish. So no matter which avenue one chose, cultivation of favourable public opinion was a very necessary step in Ireland. So you can see that goes back to 1917, you know. However, as the work of the Irish mission in the United States progressed, it was clear that there was tensions within the Irish community in America. Recent scholarship on the split in the Irish-American nationalist movement have argued that the split involved fundamental issues about the Irish movement in the United States. Really, whether that movement was to be directed by Americans in consultation with the Irish, or whether the movement was to be directed by Irishmen, perhaps in consultation with Americans. The old Fenian, John Devoy, there's Cohen, and the leader of the Friends of Irish Freedom, Judge Daniel Cohen, supported the former, that it would be American-led and we'd consult with Ireland. And members of his staff who supported De Valera, like Harry Boland and stuff, of course, preferred Irishmen drive it. These were principles over which honest men might differ, but in the circumstances, the principles became the source of a bitter personal fight, carried out in public between De Valera and his followers, and Devoy and Cohen and their followers on the other side. Devoy wrote in an early letter to Arthur Griffith about Cohen, "Big as this country is, it is not big enough to hold the judge and myself." The split, so I'll just show you back those numbers. So this was Fenway Park, I think, yeah. So you can see here, like, there's American flags and the Irish flags. Now, of course, we weren't really using the tricolour all the time at that point. Sometimes it was the green flag of the harp, which had been removed from a hotel in Boston at the insistence of the British guests. The consulate said they would never stay in the hotel again if they didn't take down the flag. So they did. And here they are in Syracuse. So there's just a few of these, you know, pictures. San Francisco. There he is unveiling a statue of Robert Emmet in Golden Gate Park. And there he is in Butte, Montana, where he spoke to 10,000 people, like. And then here's all these Friends of Irish Freedom. So here's the invitation to the dinner in October 1919. He wasn't long in. And then, sheet music. So there was a variety of ways, and here's the bond. I'll come back to that. Oh no, this is all right. So the split first emerged over money. Difficulties had begun to build in the autumn of 1919 during the preliminary publicity for the bond certificate. John Splane, who was a key drive organiser in Connecticut, listed the difficulties he had been having and complained about De Valera to the national drive manager, Frank Walsh. He doesn't know America, and apparently some of those who are directing him don't know America. De Valera explained his plan was to raise a loan of $10 million through selling bonds, which Cohen regarded as preposterous and probably illegal. His alternative was that the Friends of Irish Freedom should continue raising money through its Victory Fund. I have a picture of that in a minute, from which a significant portion would then be given to De Valera, but this didn't suit De Valera. Apart from the question of the amount of money involved, the floating of a bond would help the propaganda campaign in favour of recognition of the Republic. Charities solicit donations, but states issue bonds. And so this bond, was backed by the technically Irish government, the Dáil. Michael Collins had set up a system. They did actually get a lot of this money back over to the country. So it appeared that if De Valera wanted to float a bond, he was going to be on his own. But before those squabbles could develop further, De Valera went to meet the people. His first public meeting, I showed you, was in Fenway Park in Boston, where local papers estimated the attendance at 60,000. Gee, man. De Valera had to apologise at the start because his voice wouldn't carry to the edges of the crowd. A few days later in Wrigley Field, he was unable to begin his speech, I told you, for about half an hour, and he was lifted shoulder high on the platform. The reception was as enthusiastic everywhere he went on that initial swing. New Jersey, Rhode Island, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Utah, Montana and California. He wrote home to Michael Collins complaining, "I spend most of my time shaking hands. I'll have the biceps of a blacksmith before I'm finished. Had I time, I'd get articles into all the newspapers. I'm out today in private house led by a friend. May get some work done now. Lord, as I write, here comes another visitor." So with the Friends of Irish Freedom proving uncooperative, De Valera began establishing a new organisation to run the bond drive and took legal advice from a young but politically experienced lawyer by the name of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The original aim was that the bond drive would begin in October, just as De Valera was beginning his full national tour, but that proved impossible. And Sinn Féin's financial expert, who had been a Home Rule MP and a businessman, James O'Mara, was brought over from Ireland to sort out the organisation. O'Mara proved brilliant at raising bond money, although he disagreed with De Valera on some of the kind of questions of managing money and left the job, and his brother was hired only about a year in. The nationwide tour then for this new kind of bond drive began in Philadelphia on the 1st of October, and De Valera spoke in front of the Liberty Bell in Independence Hall and to 3,000 people in the Opera House the following evening. His departure from the city was delayed by a crowd of 10,000 people, out in the streets, and then another 10,000 greeted him at his next stop in Pittsburgh. So this bond drive was the first external loan and was launched in New York on January of 1920. As President of Ireland, Eamon de Valera received the freedom of the city from Mayor Hylan. I think I put a photograph of him in somewhere. In a minute. And he purchased the first bond of the issue in a ceremony open to the press. De Valera explained the terms of the loan to the journalists in attendance, using the language of statehood, while taking care not to misrepresent his case. It will be distinctly understood, he said, by each subscriber to the loan that he is making a free gift of his money. Repayment of the amount subscribed is contingent wholly upon the recognition of the Irish Republic as an independent nation. To avoid accusations of fraud, the Dáil's bonds were called bond certificates, which were exchangeable for bonds of the Irish Republic once that entity gained international recognition. The bond drive closed for new subscriptions on the 14th of October 1920. There we go. According to the historian Francis Carroll, it's over $5 million in proceeds was the largest amount ever raised by the Irish movement in America. Leading the pack, of course, was New York State, which raised a whopping $1,453,000, representing almost over a quarter of the total. Manhattan alone subscribed $600,000. The New York State total was followed by $1,037,000 from Massachusetts, and then Pennsylvania, California, Illinois, which raised $540,000, $386,000, and $381,000 respectively. When measured in per capita items, Massachusetts was by far the biggest contributor, with $2,692 per 10,000 inhabitants. The largest subscription, $20,000, came from John McGinley, who was chairperson of the West Penn Steel Company. While this man, Edward Doheny, the California oil baron and inspiration for the movie There Will Be Blood, subscribed $10,000. Another large subscription, also $10,000, came from Thomas Maloney, who was a Kentucky-born son of Irish parents, who was president of the L'Oreal Tobacco Company in Jersey City. In the words of the bond drive secretary in Manhattan, most of the subscribers were poor people who, quote, put their savings of years on the altar of the Irish Republic. In fact, 210,000, which was 76% of the 276,000 subscribers, purchased bond certificates in denominations of just $10. So they made up, almost half of the entire $5 million total. And of course, these would have been women working as maids and men working construction jobs. In the early 20th century, the Irish hadn't fully hit it big time yet. Now, here we have the Republican Convention, right? Before we get to that, another rift between the Coughlin and De Valera camp emerged following De Valera's claim in an interview that Irish-British relations could be analogous to the relationship between Cuba and America, which of course, were not necessarily good. And this enraged the Coughlin de Voy camp, which accused him of surrendering the idea of full Irish sovereignty. The Gaelic American newspaper turned upon De Valera the vitriolic rhetoric that they had previously reserved for the British government, Home Rulers or President Wilson. The interview was a serious tactical blunder because it appeared to weaken De Valera's own public stance on full Irish independence, but also because it gave these Irish Americans, who were already critical and mistrustful of him, another important issue on which to attack him. And that interview brought the controversy out into the open and began to force people to choose one side over the other. Further squabbling ensued between both parties, with De Valera questioning the loyalty of the Friends of Irish Freedom and their desire to even help resolve the Irish question. This naturally conjured a predictable response from Coughlin, who maintained that he was an American citizen who supported Ireland. Similarly, he claimed that De Valera had no right to interfere in American politics. This war of words between De Valera and Coghlan eventually culminated in an emergency meeting of the Friends of Irish Freedom on the 19th of March 1920, which became known as the Trial of De Valera. The meeting was supposed to be in private and without De Valera's knowledge. It was arranged to discuss the manner of his behaviour since his arrival in America the previous year, and they were actually going to demand that he leave. But Harry Boland heard that the meeting was on, and so to the surprise of everybody, De Valera arrived back at the Park Avenue Hotel with Joseph McGarrity and Harry Boland. A dramatic scene unfolded, and following a lengthy 8 hours of heated discussion, it was decided that De Valera would no longer meddle in affairs which were strictly of American concern, and in return Coghlan promised he would do the same for matters which were solely Irish. So their increasingly acrimonious relationship spilled over into the 1920 Republican and Democratic conventions. The Friends of Irish Freedom hoped to convince both Democrat and Republican Party to include platform planks recognising the Irish Republic. In the run-up to the Republican National Convention in 1920, De Valera lobbied to borrow $50,000 from the Friends in order to make a splash at the convention. Recognising that spending such a large amount of money on hotels and entertaining would provoke negative press coverage, Daniel Coghlan opposed the loan. The money had, after all, been earmarked for the Irish independence movement. What would it look like to spend that money on more fancy hotels and political bribes? Don't forget, De Valera has been officially living at the Walter Astoria all of this time, and no money has gone back to Ireland yet to purchase guns or bullets. Coghlan was opposed to the idea of a head of state directly lobbying a political party. He felt that a display like that would diminish De Valera's standing within the United States. It was one thing for a head of state to meet with the sitting president, but quite another to meet in the smoke-filled back rooms where political platforms were put together. On top of that, Coghlan likely surmised that an American political party would bristle at a foreign political leader trying to dictate political party policy. Originally, De Valera was not supposed to even attend the convention, but he got word that Coghlan had no intention of demanding recognition for Ireland, and so De Valera quickly made his way to Chicago. Coghlan and De Valera both led competing delegations to the Republican Convention in Chicago, arriving at the beginning of June. De Valera was in the media from the second he arrived. He addressed a crowd saying, "We hope to have America recognize the government of a nation which also stands for a government by consent of the governed." Both of the men's groups met before the Republican committee in charge of the political platform, and they gave conflicting presentations 2 hours apart on the morning of June 9th. Coghlan sought to present the case of Irish independence to the Resolutions Committee. He believed that searching for just independence was the right course of action to take, because calling for an Irish Republic would be detrimental to their overall aims and feed into pro-British propaganda, which Coghlan directed so much of the Friends of Irish Freedom's energy towards dissuading. So as a result of that stance, Coghlan recognised that he needed to keep his plans hidden from De Valera, whom he felt he could not trust. This plan, of course, failed. De Valera bypassed him, and despite being advised by numerous people to set aside his differences this one time and allow Coghlan to play the American political game, and don't forget they had agreed to this back in March, De Valera advanced forward with his resolution, which was comprehensively rejected by a 12-to-1 vote. In contrast, Coghlan's resolution was adopted by a narrow majority, 7-6. Crucially, however, the high public level of disunity displayed by the Irish and the Irish-American nationalists at the Republican Convention left politicians begging the question how they could move forward and give support to the Irish cause when the issue itself was the source of so much tension and turmoil between the different Irish factions. As a result, when De Valera publicly renounced Coghlan's resolution, the Republican Committee agreed to remove it from their agenda. So both factions came away empty-handed and with less money to show for their trouble. De Valera then hoped that the Democratic Convention in San Francisco would be a better chance to get a strong Irish Republican plank inserted into the platform. After the kind of disastrous spectacle that had been Chicago, De Valera and his party decided to have a more reserved presence at their second convention. At first, the Democratic Party did look like a more receptive group. Coghlan and the Friends of Irish Freedom would not attend because Coghlan had already openly endorsed the failed Republican candidate Hiram Johnson. So now, without a competitor, De Valera and his supporters could enter the convention presenting a united front. So this lack of competition actually allowed De Valera to propose the very same failed plank that he proposed at the Republican convention. Now, he did believe, though, that he had several allies on the Committee on Resolutions going into the convention. Major party bosses, of course, had Irish sympathies, including Tammany Hall boss Charles Murphy, and they would be present at the convention. Several politicians on the committee, including Irish Americans like Massachusetts Senator David Walsh, would also provide sympathetic ears. But his confidence proved to be misplaced. The Democratic Party had, in fact, adopted their party platform by March of 1920. The platform and its planks were more or less locked in, and there was not much room for negotiation. The outgoing President Wilson had made it explicit that he did not want the party to include a plank on Irish independence, neutralising any chance of